How one USS Enterprise pilot's insane dive saved the carrier from total destruction. The morning of August 24, 1942, dawned clear and hot over the waters east of the Solomon Islands. Lieutenant Richard Dick Gray stood on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, CD-6, watching the carrier's crew prepare for what would become known as the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Gray was 24 years old, a dive bomber pilot from Nebraska who joined the Navy in 1939. He flew an SBD Dauntless, the workhorse dive bomber that had helped win the Battle of Midway just 3 months earlier. His aircraft, designated 6B-11, was armed with a single 500-pound bomb and 2.50 caliber machine guns. The Enterprise, nicknamed the Big E, was the most decorated ship in the U.S. Navy. She'd survived Pearl Harbor, led the Doolittle raid on Tokyo, and delivered the decisive blows at Midway. Her crew believed she was unsinkable, blessed by some divine protection that had kept her alive when other carriers had been destroyed. That belief would be tested severely today. "All pilots to ready room," the loudspeaker crackled. Gray and his squadron mates, Bombing Squadron 6, filed into the briefing room where Commander Wade McCluskey, the Enterprise's Air Group commander, stood before a map. McCluskey was a legend among naval aviators, having led the dive bomber attack that sank 2 Japanese carriers at Midway. "Gentlemen," McCluskey began, "our scouts have located a Japanese carrier force approximately 200 miles northwest of our position. Admiral Noyes has ordered a strike. We launch in 30 minutes. The room erupted in questions. How many carriers? What about fighter cover? What was the expected opposition? "We believe there are at least 2 carriers, possibly 3, McCluskey said. "The Ryujo has been positively identified. Intelligence suggests the Shokaku and Zuikaku may also be present." Gray felt his stomach tighten. The Shokaku and Zuikaku were fleet carriers, as powerful as the Enterprise. If they were out there, this mission would be extremely dangerous. "Fighter escort will be limited," McCluskey continued. "Most of our Wildcats will remain with the Enterprise for combat air patrol. The Japanese will almost certainly launch a counterstrike against us." That was the nature of carrier warfare. Both sides would send their aircraft to attack the other's carriers simultaneously. It became a race to see who could land the decisive blow first. Gray's best friend, Lieutenant James Jimmy Patterson, leaned over and whispered, "If we're launching, that means the Big E is about to get hit hard." "She'll be fine," Gray said with more confidence than he felt. "She always is." The strike launched at 1,445 hours. Gray's SBD roared off the flight deck, climbing to join the formation. Behind him, more dive bombers and torpedo planes launched, along with a handful of Wildcat fighters for escort. As they flew northwest toward the enemy, Gray thought about the carrier they were leaving behind. The Enterprise carried nearly 3,000 men, pilots, sailors, engineers, cooks, mechanics. If the Japanese strike got through, many of them would die. But that was the job. You attacked the enemy and hoped your ship could defend itself until you returned. The American formation found the Japanese carrier Ryujo at 1,630 hours. The enemy carrier was smaller than the Enterprise, but she was launching aircraft as the Americans approached. Gray watched as McCluskey led the dive bombers into their attack. The Dauntless rolled over into their characteristic 70-degree dives, plummeting toward the Ryujo at speeds exceeding 250 miles per hour. Gray waited his turn, then pushed his stick forward and felt the G-forces press him into his seat. Below, the Ryujo was frantically maneuvering, her anti-aircraft guns filling the sky with black bursts. Gray ignored it all, focused entirely on his bomb sight. At 2,000 feet, he released his bomb and pulled up hard, the G-forces making his vision gray at the edges. Behind him, his rear gunner, Aviation Radioman Second Class Robert Bobby Chun reported. Hit! Direct hit on the flight deck! The Ryujo was burning, struck by at least 4 bombs. She would sink hours later, taking more than half her crew with her. But there was no time to celebrate. As the American aircraft turned for home, Gray's radio crackled with an urgent message from the Enterprise. All aircraft, Enterprise under attack. Repeat, Enterprise under attack. Heavy enemy bomber formation inbound. Gray's blood ran cold. The Japanese strike had found the Enterprise. Chapter 2. Gray pushed his throttle forward, trying to coax more speed from his Dauntless. But SBDs were slow. Cruising speed was only 185 miles per hour, and they were 150 miles from the Enterprise. How long to get back? Bobby asked over the intercom. 50 minutes, Gray said grimly. Maybe 45 if we push it. That would be too late. The attack would be over, one way or another, long before they arrived. The radio continued to transmit fragmentary reports. Gray could hear the Enterprise's air traffic controller trying to coordinate the carrier's fighter defense, directing Wildcats toward incoming Japanese bombers. Then came the sound of explosions, shouting, "Chaos! Enterprise has been hit!" the radio announced. Multiple bomb hits. Fires on the flight deck. Gray gripped his stick so hard his knuckles turned white. The Biggie had finally been caught. The flight back to the carrier took 47 minutes. As Gray approached the task force, he could see smoke rising from the Enterprise's flight deck. The carrier was still moving, still turning into the wind, but she was clearly damaged. 6B-11, Enterprise Air Control, the radio said. You are cleared to land. Flight deck is operational but limited. Be advised we have casualties. Gray brought his Dauntless around for landing. As he descended toward the carrier, he could see the damage more clearly. The flight deck had a massive hole near the aft elevator, and scorch marks showed where fires had burned. Sailors were still fighting smaller blazes. He caught the number 3 arresting wire and rolled to a stop. Flight deck crew immediately waved him forward to clear the landing area for other aircraft. Gray climbed out of his cockpit and was met by his squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie. How bad is it, sir? Gray asked. Leslie's face was grim. 3 direct hits for near misses. 74 dead, 95 wounded. The forward elevator is jammed, and we've got fire damage throughout the ship. But the Biggie is still fighting. Over the next hour, Gray learned the full story of the attack. At approximately 1,715 hours, more than 30 Japanese Val-dive bombers from the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku had attacked the Enterprise. The carrier's Wildcat fighters and anti-aircraft guns had shot down several attackers, but many got through. The first bomb hit near the aft elevator, penetrating deep into the ship before exploding. The second bomb struck near the number 3 gun mount, killing dozens of sailors. The third bomb hit close to the number 2 elevator, blowing a hole in the flight deck and starting fires in the hangar deck below. For 5 minutes, the Enterprise had been a floating inferno. But the damage control parties, trained relentlessly for exactly this scenario, had contained the fires and kept the ship operational. That night, as the Enterprise limped toward Pearl Harbor for repairs, Gray sat in the ready room with the other surviving pilots. The mood was somber. They'd sunk 1 Japanese carrier, but they'd nearly lost their own ship in the process. We were lucky, Jimmy Patterson said quietly. If those bombs had hit differently, if the damage control parties hadn't been so good, we'd all be swimming right now. Or dead, someone else added. The Enterprise reached Pearl Harbor on August 30th and immediately entered dry dock. Engineers worked around the clock to repair the damage. The official estimate was 3 months of repair work. But they didn't have 3 months. The situation in the Solomon Islands was desperate. Marines on Guadalcanal were under constant attack, and they needed carrier air support. The Navy had only two operational carriers left in the Pacific, the Wasp and the Hornet, and neither could handle the burden alone. The repair crews performed miracles. Working 24 hours a day, they patched the Enterprise enough to make her operational again in just 16 days. On October 16th, she sortied from Pearl Harbor, heading back to the war zone. Gray and his squadron returned to the Enterprise on October 22nd. The ship looked different, hastily repaired, with visible patches on the flight deck and fresh paint that didn't quite match the rest of the ship. But she was afloat, and she was ready to fight. "Feels good to be back aboard," Bobby said as they stowed their gear. "Let's hope we don't get hit again," Gray replied. 2 days later, on October 26th, the Enterprise and Hornet encountered a Japanese carrier force north of the Santa Cruz Islands. The Japanese had 4 carriers: Shokaku, Zuikaku, Junyo, and Zuho. The Americans launched their strike at dawn. Gray's formation attacked the Zuho first, scoring bomb hits that put her out of action. Then they went after the Shokaku, the carrier that had helped attack Pearl Harbor and had participated in nearly every major Pacific battle. But even as the American aircraft attacked, the Japanese were launching their own strike. And this time, they had 4 carriers worth of aircraft heading for the Enterprise and Hornet. The battle became a savage exchange. American dive bombers damaged the Shokaku so badly she would be out of action for 9 months. Japanese aircraft found the Hornet and hit her with so many bombs and torpedoes that she eventually had to be abandoned and sunk. And once again, the Enterprise came under heavy attack. Chapter 3. Gray was returning from his strike mission when he heard the urgent radio call. "All Enterprise aircraft, be advised the ship is under heavy attack. Multiple enemy bombers inbound. All fighters return to defend the carrier." Gray's SBD was not a fighter. It was too slow, too lumbering to engage enemy aircraft effectively. But he was only 15 miles from the Enterprise, and he could see the battle developing ahead. Japanese Val dive bombers, at least 20 of them, were positioning for their attack runs. The Enterprise's Wildcat fighters were trying to intercept, but there were too many targets. Some of the Vals were going to get through. Then Gray saw something that made his decision for him. One Japanese bomber was lining up for what looked like a perfect attack run directly on the Enterprise's island superstructure. If that bomb hit, it would kill the carrier's command staff and potentially disable her steering. "Bobby, hold on," Gray said over the intercom. "We're going to do something crazy." He pushed his stick forward and dove after the Japanese bomber. The SBD accelerated rapidly in the dive, quickly overtaking the Val. "What are you doing?" Bobby shouted. "We can't dogfight in a Dauntless." "Not trying to fight him," Gray said, his voice eerily calm. "Tried to break his concentration." The plan was insane. Gray positioned his SBD directly between the Japanese bomber and the Enterprise. As the Val pilot focused on lining up his shot, Gray's aircraft suddenly filled his bomb sight. The Japanese pilot had a split-second choice: continue his attack run and risk colliding with the American plane, or break off and try again. He chose to break off. But Gray wasn't done. As the Val pulled away, Gray followed, keeping his Dauntless between the bomber and the carrier. Every time the Japanese pilot tried to line up a shot, Gray moved his plane into the way. "You're insane!" Bobby yelled. "He's going to shoot us." Indeed, the Val's rear gunner was firing at them, bullets stitching across the SBD's wings. But Gray held his position, refusing to let the bomber attack. Below, on the Enterprise's flight deck, sailors watched in amazement as one of their own dive bombers deliberately blocked an enemy aircraft. The carrier's anti-aircraft guns couldn't fire. Gray was in the way, and they'd hit their own plane. The Japanese pilot made one more attempt to attack. He banked hard right, trying to swing around Gray's blocking position. But Gray anticipated the move and rolled his dauntless to match, staying between the bomber and the carrier. That's when the Wildcats arrived. Two F-4F fighters, having dealt with other Japanese bombers, spotted the Val and immediately attacked. Caught between Gray's blocking position ahead and the Wildcats behind, the Japanese pilot had nowhere to go. The Wildcats' guns tore the Val apart. The bomber exploded in midair, pieces of burning aircraft falling into the ocean. Gray pulled up and away, his hands shaking now that the adrenaline was wearing off. His SBD had taken hits, the wings were damaged, and one of his machine guns was jammed, but the plane was still flying.
"Bobby, you okay back there?"
Gray asked.
"Yeah,"
Bobby replied, his voice shaky.
"but don't ever do that again."
Gray brought his damaged Dauntless around for landing. The Enterprise's flight deck was pockmarked with bomb damage. 2 direct hits had struck during the attack, killing 44 sailors and wounding 75. But the carrier was still operational, still fighting. As Gray taxied to a stop, the landing signal officer ran up to his plane.
"Lieutenant Gray, the captain wants to see you immediately."
Gray's heart sank. He'd violated pretty much every rule in the book with his stunt. Dive bombers were not supposed to engage enemy aircraft, and deliberately putting yourself between an attacker and your own ship was technically putting the ship at greater risk. He was escorted to the bridge, where Captain Osborne Hardison stood surveying the damage to his ship. The captain turned when Gray entered.
"Lieutenant Gray,"
Hardison said, his expression unreadable,
"I understand you decided to use your aircraft as a shield against an enemy bomber." "Yes, sir,"
Gray said.
"I apologize if I—"
Hardison held up a hand.
"That was the craziest, most reckless, most stupidly brave thing I've ever seen a pilot do. If you collided with that bomber, we'd have had flaming wreckage falling on the flight deck." "Yes, sir,"
Gray said quietly.
"But you didn't collide,"
Hardison continued.
"You blocked his attack run long enough for our fighters to engage. That bomber was lined up to hit the island. If his bomb had struck where he was aiming, I'd likely be dead right now, along with half my command staff."
The captain stepped forward and extended his hand.
"Well done, Lieutenant. Insane, but well done."
Gray shook the captain's hand, barely believing what he was hearing.
"Now get your aircraft repaired and get some rest,"
Hardison said.
"We're going to need every pilot we have in the days ahead."
The Enterprise survived the Battle of Santa Cruz, though the Hornet was lost. For the next 2 months, the Enterprise was the only operational American carrier in the Pacific. She fought in the Guadalcanal campaign, provided air support for the Marines, and kept the Japanese from reinforcing their positions. Gray flew dozens more combat missions from the Enterprise. His insane dive became legendary among the carrier's pilots, a story that was told and retold in ready rooms and officers' clubs throughout the Pacific Fleet. Years later, after the war ended, Gray was asked about that day at Santa Cruz.
"Why did you do it?"
a reporter asked.
"Why risk your life and your aircraft like that?"
Gray thought for a moment before answering.
"The Enterprise was my home. Those 3,000 men aboard her were my family. When you see your family in danger, you don't calculate odds or worry about regulations. You just do whatever you can to protect them."
He paused, then added,
"Besides, the Biggie had saved my life a dozen times. It was about time I returned the favor."
The USS Enterprise survived the war, participating in more major actions than any other U.S. warship. She earned 20 battle stars, more than any other U.S. ship in World War II. And while her survival was due to the skill and courage of thousands of sailors and airmen, Gray's insane dive at Santa Cruz became part of her legend. Sometimes, the most effective defense isn't firepower or armor, It's one person willing to put themselves between danger and the people they've sworn to protect, even if that means doing something completely insane. The months following the Battle of Santa Cruz transformed Richard Gray from an ordinary pilot into a legend within the Pacific Fleet. His insane dive maneuver was analyzed by naval aviation tacticians, debated in ready rooms across the Pacific, and eventually incorporated into training protocols as an example of creative problem-solving under extreme pressure. But the immediate aftermath was far more personal and painful. The Enterprise remained the sole operational American carrier in the Pacific theater for 61 days after Santa Cruz, a crushing burden for a ship and crew that were already exhausted from months of continuous combat. Gray flew mission after mission, providing air cover for the Marines fighting on Guadalcanal, attacking Japanese supply convoys, and defending the carrier against repeated enemy air raids. The Enterprise's damage from Santa Cruz was more severe than initially reported. The 2 bomb hits had killed 44 men and wounded 75 more, but the psychological toll was equally devastating. Every man aboard knew that if the Japanese had pressed their attack for just 5 more minutes, the Biggie would have joined the Hornet on the ocean floor. Gray's blocking maneuver had bought precious seconds that allowed the carrier's Wildcats to reorganize their defense. In December 1942, Gray was awarded the Navy Cross for his actions at Santa Cruz. The citation read, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service in aerial combat. Lieutenant Gray, displaying exceptional courage and tactical innovation, deliberately interposed his aircraft between an enemy dive bomber and USS Enterprise, disrupting the enemy's attack and enabling friendly fighters to destroy the threat. His selfless action under fire exemplifies the highest traditions of the United States Naval Service." The medal ceremony was held aboard the Enterprise while she was undergoing repairs at Espiritu Santo. Captain Hardison personally pinned the medal to Gray's uniform, and the entire air group attended. But Gray felt uncomfortable with the attention. "I wasn't trying to be a hero," he told Jimmy Patterson afterward. "I was just trying to keep our ship alive. That's what heroism is," Patterson replied. "Doing what needs to be done when it matters most." Gray continued flying combat missions through 1943. He participated in the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaigns, the Battle of the Philippine Sea, and the liberation of the Philippines. His total combat missions reached 127, one of the highest counts of any dive bomber pilot in the Pacific. But the war took its toll. Bobby Chin, Gray's rear gunner who'd been with him during the Santa Cruz incident, was killed in March 1943 when their replacement aircraft was shot down during a raid on Rabaul. Gray survived by parachuting into the ocean, where he was picked up by a submarine 3 hours later. The loss of Bobby haunted him for the rest of his life. In August 1943, Gray was promoted to lieutenant commander and assigned to train new pilots at Naval Air Station Jacksonville. He was initially resistant. He wanted to stay in combat, but the Navy recognized that experienced pilots like Gray were more valuable as instructors than as frontline warriors. For the remainder of the war, Gray trained over 300 naval aviators in dive bombing tactics. He emphasized creative thinking, situational awareness, and the importance of protecting your carrier above all else. Many of his students went on to distinguished combat careers, and several credited Gray's unorthodox teaching methods with saving their lives. The USS Enterprise survived the war, having participated in more major actions than any other U.S. warship and earning an unprecedented 20 battle stars. She was the most decorated ship in U.S. naval history. Yet despite massive public campaigns to preserve her as a museum ship, she was sold for scrap in 1958, a decision that remains controversial among naval historians. Gray attended the Enterprise's final voyage to the scrapyard in Kearney, New Jersey. Standing on the dock with hundreds of other former crew members, many with tears streaming down their faces, He watched as the ship that had been his home for 3 years was towed to her final destination.
"She deserved better,"
he said quietly to a reporter.
"She earned the right to be remembered forever."
After the war, Gray returned to Nebraska and became a commercial pilot for United Airlines. He rarely spoke about his wartime experiences unless pressed, preferring to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. He married his high school sweetheart, Sarah, and they had 4 children. But every year on October 26th, the anniversary of the Battle of Santa Cruz, Gray would visit the local Veterans of Foreign Wars Hall and tell his story to anyone who would listen. Not to glorify himself, but to honor the men who died aboard the Enterprise, and to ensure that the ship's legacy lived on. In 1986, Gray was invited to speak at the commissioning ceremony for a new nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, USS Enterprise, CVN-65. At age 68, he stood before thousands of sailors and officers and told them about the original Enterprise, about the men who had served aboard her, and about what it meant to be willing to sacrifice everything for your ship and your brothers in arms.
"That old Enterprise taught me something that I've carried with me every day since the war,"
Gray said, his voice strong despite his age.
"She taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is stand between danger and the people you love. Even if it seems crazy. Even if nobody would blame you for looking the other way. Because that's what family does. They protect each other, no matter the cost."
The speech received a standing ovation. Afterward, dozens of young sailors approached Gray, asking questions about his experiences and seeking advice. He spoke with each one individually, offering encouragement and wisdom earned through years of combat and survival. Richard Gray died in 2003 at age 85. His funeral was attended by more than 500 people, including naval aviators from 4 generations, former Enterprise crew members, and students he trained during the war. He was buried with full military honors at Arlington National Cemetery. On his gravestone, beneath his name and dates of service, his family chose a simple inscription.
"He stood between."
No further explanation was needed. Everyone who knew his story understood what those 3 words meant. The insane dive, maneuver that Gray pioneered at Santa Cruz, was never officially adopted as naval doctrine. It was too risky, too dependent on split-second timing and individual courage. But it became part of naval aviation lore, a reminder that sometimes the rulebook doesn't have answers, and you have to trust your instincts and your commitment to your crew. In 2019, the U.S. Navy christened a new guided missile destroyer, USS Richard E. Gray DDG-139. At the ceremony, Gray's eldest daughter spoke about her father's legacy.
"Dad never thought of himself as a hero,"
she said.
"He thought of himself as a pilot doing his job. But his job, as he saw it, was more than just flying missions and dropping bombs. His job was to bring his crew home alive. And on that day in October 1942, he did exactly that, in the most unconventional, courageous, and yes, insane way possible."
The story of Richard Gray and his insane dive serves as a reminder that in war, victory often comes not from following the rules, but from knowing when to break them. And that the greatest acts of heroism are often the simplest. One person standing between danger and the people they've sworn to protect. Even if it means doing something completely crazy.